You're live.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Today I'm doing something a little different than what I normally do as far as, whether or not it's a teaching. I think this is going to be more like a sharing, more like a journey for us. One of the things that, if you've ever heard me teach before, I have a tendency to cover a lot of scripture in a very short period of time. So as usual, I say, warm up your fingers. We're not going to do that much page turning, but you're going to get exposed to a lot of scripture in a short period of time, but we're going to have fun. And my goal here is to try to make it fun and make it a little bit funny. So I'm going to be a little cartoonish on some of the topics, and I think we're going to have a good time. So what I'm going to share on today is the book of Judges. And Judges is an interesting book because there's a lot of symbology in Judges, both in numbers and in other things. But Judges is kind of a peculiar book that stands out in the fact that there's not a whole lot of Christ-line logic that goes through the book of Judges and into the gospel. So a lot of times Judges gets taught as kind of Bible stories, or if you were in Bible camp or something to that effect, vacation Bible school or something like that, you heard some of the Judges stories, and then most of the scholarly type teachings kind of steer away from Judges because it's kind of a misfit book. But I disagree. I think it's not a misfit book. And I believe personally that that the Old Testament books were written as instructions to us, but also specific instructions for Christ to learn. These were the ways that God communicated with Christ and how he needs to be as a person. And Judges specifically has a very poignant purpose. The Hebrew word that's used in Judges is, and I'm probably going to butcher this, so bear with me, is sephir, or it sounds like S-E-H-F-I-R, so sephir or sephir. And what it means, the Hebrew word that's used is to give or to execute the law in a political, civil, religious, social session. So to be kind of like a political, civil, religious, social leader, so to speak, without actually having station. So without actually being, like an administrator or something like that, they're like a hero that everybody follows, like a local hero that you just, oh, look what so-and-so is doing. That's a good idea. We should all do that. So trendsetter, right? So they're these leaders, rulers is not the right word. These leaders, these heroes of the Old Testament. So when Jesus would have been reading the book of Judges or in the scrolls, he's reading about all of these heroes, these great warriors and things like that. And it's really peculiar what God decides to write down about these heroes, because some of it is very cartoonish. That some of the things that have been written down, and you go, and that's it, and okay, moving on. But some things it gets expanded upon very, very much. So we're going to go through the book of Judges and kind of talk, and then we'll take breaks and talk about what Jesus may have learned from those particular judges. For those of you who don't know, there are 12 judges, right? In the book of Judges, there are a total of 12 that are mentioned. Some of them are mentioned very briefly, but there are 12 judges. And one of the things that is a running trend through the book of Judges that makes it such a unique book is there is a lot, and I mean a lot, of numerology throughout the book of Judges. The numbers come up over and over and over again. And I'm not big on what the numbers mean and anything like that, but I will share some of the things that E.W. Bullinger has said about the numbers that are in the numbers that are used, because they do have symbolic meaning that are in the book of Judges. So let's go. So the first judge that we reference. Let's go ahead and open our Bibles, and while you're opening, I'll talk. We're going to start in Judges chapter 3. Now I'll be reading out of the NIV. I've looked at the REV and compared it to the NAV, and they're pretty much the same. They're with some minor one major word change, which I will definitely highlight. But the NIV and the REV are very similar in the book of Judges. So we can go ahead and start. We're going to be in chapter 3. Chapter 3 starts off, so to set the stage, right? The judges have just came out of the 40 years in the desert, and they're settling in Canaan. And Joshua, the book before Judges, Joshua has gone through and they've kind of conquered the land, and they've taken the land that's theirs. And Judges chapter 3 kind of ends or begins where Joshua has died, and the Israelites have very quickly, which they have a tendency to do, forgotten about God. And they've kind of fallen into idolatry and perversion and a bunch of other things. So we have the first judge, who is Othniel. And he starts out in chapter 3, verse 7, where they did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And Othniel was kind of unique because Othniel was with, as a boy, he was with Joshua. So he was a young boy when Joshua was going all through the land conquering things. So he probably would have been a baby at the time of Moses, and then he's the younger brother of one of Joshua's compatriots. So he's this young kid, and he comes out and he saves Israel from the Cushan. We'll just go with Cushan, the king of Aram, and he saves Israel from the oppression of the king of Aram, and they get 40 years of peace. So there's our second number that pops out is 40 years of peace. So he very early on, the Israelites kind of start to fall away. Othniel gathers them up, leads them, defeats somebody who's oppressing them, and they get 40 years of peace, right? So then Othniel dies, and virtually on almost every single judge that we go through, as soon as the judge dies, as soon as the leader dies or the hero dies, they very quickly fall back into their nefarious ways. The Israelites they have some sort of ADD affliction or something to that effect, because they keep managing to fall right back into their horrible ways, despite the terrible, terrible oppression that they endure while they're doing it. So Othniel dies. We get 40 years of peace under Othniel. Othniel dies. Immediately the Israelites go back. And then we have Ehud. And Ehud comes out. And Ehud is the first one where that we get an experience as to why John Hickman refers to Judges as the book of no excuse. Because Ehud is a judge, and this is a running theme with many of the judges, who are in some way, shape, form, or fashion not the likely person to lead. So sometimes, Ehud is a lefty, first of all. So I know we got some lefties out there. But during this time, it was really bad to be a lefty because you were looked at as a cripple. And it wasn't a really good thing, right? So to take it kind of into the toilet a little bit, in those times, toilet paper wasn't a thing, and you had to figure out some way to clean yourself. So most people were right-handed and would eat with their right hand, so they would wipe themselves with their left hand. So a person that was a lefty was kind of like a social pariah because they were gross, because they couldn't really use that hand for the normal things. So Ehud is this lefty, so he's kind of like a social pariah. He's kind of this weird, like, ew, look at that left-handed person. Maybe there's something wrong with him mentally or something. They're not really okay with him. So he's already kind of incapacitated, and when he comes on the scene, Israel has been oppressed, and Ehud's story starts in verse 12. Israel has been now oppressed for 18 years. So Othniel died after 40 years of peace. Then Israel gets oppressed again by Eglon, the Moabite, and then they're under the oppression of Eglon, the Moabite, for 18 years. 18 years. That is a long time to be oppressed. So Ehud comes along, and the Israelites cried out for a savior, for somebody to help them. Ehud comes along. He becomes the judge. And what does he do is he sneaks into Eglon's room. And Eglon was an enormously fat person, which is a rare thing in that time period, right? So his wealth, his expansive wealth, he just would have been engorging himself on food. So you can imagine that in this area where we have fertile land and desert mixed together like Israel is, to be fat meant that you were eating everyone else's food. So the Israelites, the oppression that you can imagine here is they're all starving, and you've got this giant fat person as the king because he's taking all of their food, and he's so Ehud climbs. What he does is he convinces the king, as he requests his presence, and he tells him that he has a secret, that he knows there's a plot against Eglon, and he's got a secret, and he must tell him, but he can't trust anybody in the room. So Eglon sends out all of his servants, and he says, okay, everybody needs to go away while this Ehud fella tells me this secret story. And Ehud reveals an 18-inch long dagger and plunges it into the chest of Eglon, the fat king. And he's so fat that it buries the hilt of the dagger. So his body completely consumes the dagger as it goes in. Very, very large. And then Ehud escapes off the balcony and runs away, and he gets away. So one could argue that, if you're not familiar, but Ehud could be the very first Israeli Mossad agent that, 18-inch dagger is like a small sword. Yeah, that's big, right? That's huge. And so one could argue that Ehud was the first Israeli Mossad, which is like the CIA, high CIA. I'm sure you're probably listening now. That Ehud would be the first Israeli Mossad agent because he snuck in, did an assassination, and then bolted out the balcony like some ninja. So so he was obviously there's some appeal to having him as a hero because he's pretty cool. We always talk about ninjas being, in the Far East. Nobody ever talks about a Middle East ninja, but Ehud was one. So Ehud jumps out of the balcony and escapes, and the Moabite king, the Israelites rise up, and everybody's in chaos, and Israel is saved, and Israel experiences 80 years of peace after that. Oh, so 80 years. That's a multiple of 2 for 40, right? So we have another instance of 40 years right then and there, right? So 80 years of peace, 2 times 40. Then we have one of the short versions, but this is apparently a very interesting person. So then after Ehud, we're in chapter 3 still, we're in verse 31. After Ehud came Shamgar. And all that it says of Shamgar is, and I will read specifically. We're in verse 31. He gets one verse. That's it. It says, after Ehud came Shamgar, son of Anath, who struck down 600 Philistines with an ox goad. He too saved Israel. End. That's all he gets. So apparently he was just a super violent guy, but very, very for God. Because to get you an idea of what an ox goad is, right? An ox goad can be a stick of various lengths. It might be up to 6 feet, but it also could be very, very tiny, like so. And it's basically a pointed stick with a piece of metal, a flat piece of metal on the other side, so that you could clean the ox's feet with the flat piece of metal. And then if the ox didn't want to do what you wanted it to do, you poked it with the pointy end of the stick. So this is a farm tool that was never designed to kill anybody, and he killed 600 people with it. I mean, I don't know if you guys have ever wrestled or if anybody has ever had a fight. It is exhausting one-on-one. So to do that 600 times, this man had some physical prowess. We'll say that. He did a lot of cardio. So you've got this Shamgar who kills 600 Philistines with a pointy stick, for the lack of a better term. That is an enormous undertaking, and that's all he gets. So whatever Christ, when Jesus was reading that verse, apparently that's all he needed to get that message. It's just this one verse that, hey, this dude Shamgar killed a lot of people with a pointy stick. And so let's talk about some of the things that Jesus would have understood from at least those first 3, right? So one of the things that's unique about the U.S. military is that we foster leadership at the lowest levels. And leadership is something that is very, very important to any organization, to have multiple layers of leadership, multiple tiers of leadership, and it's important. So when we look at Christ as the head, he is the ultimate leader. I mean, he's our leader. And the leadership lessons, there have been hundreds of books written on leadership lessons from Christ's life. But Christ learned some of these leadership lessons from somewhere, right? He didn't. So he had to learn them just like you or me. And I think a lot of the leadership lessons that Christ learned came from Judges. It came from this book of heroes, this book of leaders. So one of the things that we learn, that we can learn and that we can glean, is if you look in chapter 3, verse 9. Go back to verse 9, where we're talking about Othniel. It says, "But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel." So what we learn is that the people cried out, that there wasn't a leader. Nobody was there. Nobody was there to help them. And when the people cried out, God was there, and God delivered a leader. God appointed a leader when the people asked for it. The people cried out in anguish. They received forgiveness for their wrongdoings. Boom. And here comes somebody to save them. So, one of the leadership lessons to learn from that is to respond, to be there when people cry out. Ehud, what lesson could he have learned from Ehud? Hey, sometimes, very literally in Ehud's case, you got to get your hands dirty. Sometimes you need to be in the thick of it. You can't just sit back and rest on your laurels all the time. And Christ did that very well. He was always in the thick of it, leading from the front, getting his hands dirty. Another one, the tasks may seem overwhelming. This is from Shamgar, right? The tasks may seem overwhelming, but the solution is simple, just as simple as the one verse. With God, the numbers against you are irrelevant. It doesn't matter if you're one person facing 600. It doesn't matter if you don't even have a conventional weapon. You have a pointed stick. The numbers against you are irrelevant. With God, no task is overwhelming. And Jesus had some pretty significantly, normally considered overwhelming tasks that with God, it was irrelevant. Okay, so that's the first section. Let's move on to the next judge, because we're going to clip along here so I don't run out of time. So the next one is interesting because the next judge, number 4, is a lot of people don't consider. And this kind of irritates me a little bit. But Deborah is the next judge. And Deborah's a different kind of judge. Deborah's the first or the only female judge. But a lot of commentators and a lot of scholars of the Bible will say that the 4th judge is Barak. And Barak was not the judge. Deborah was the judge. Deborah was the one that was appointed, and it was Deborah who engineered everything. Barak simply obeyed what Deborah said. So I think it's a shame that we water down the accomplishments of Deborah with saying that it was Barak. Another thing that is important, that it's important to note, because this comes up later, is that Deborah is a prophetess. No, that was not Barack Obama, and it's spelled very different. It's B-A-R-A-K, not. So he's not Barack Obama, not at all. So, and I mean, we all know never mind. I'm not going to bring that political stuff in. Okay, moving on. So we have Deborah. And what does Deborah do? So Deborah is a prophetess, okay? And what's interesting about the words that are used, let's go ahead and go to chapter 4, verse 4. And it says, Deborah, a prophetess. I'm going to just stop right there, because that's very powerful, what that just said. Deborah, a prophetess. It doesn't say Deborah, the prophetess. It says a prophetess. In identifying that there were other prophetesses that were around throughout the scriptures, and even at the time that Deborah was a prophet. So it's important to see that, because a lot of people want to claim that, oh, you know, or downplay the women of role, or the role of women in a church. And it is clear through the Old Testament that that's not the case. So then we go through and we see what Deborah does. Now, Deborah, being a woman, she's not as so much of a warrior this time, but she is a master tactician and a planner, and a prophetess, of course. But you know, she engineers the things that go on in the background. So she informs Barak, and Barak goes chasing after this Philistine general Sisera, and Deborah prophesies that Sisera will die at the hands of a woman, and so Barak goes out to try to chase him down, and kill Sisera. But Sisera gets kind of freaked out and doesn't want to die at the hands of a woman. So he flees to a tent of a guy named Heber, who he thinks is his friend, right? And Heber's wife ends up killing Sisera by driving a tent spike through the side of his head. Really kind of brutal. But it's interesting because Deborah had prophesied that Sisera will die at the hands of a woman. Another thing that's interesting about that is that there are only two people in Judges who don't want to die at the hands of a woman, Sisera being one of them. And it's only the bad guys that think it's bad to die at the hands of a woman. So none of the good guys ever think, if I die, it's death. You know, it's the bad guys who make that distinction. So only the bad guys are bigots. So there's another lesson for you. Abimelech is the other one, and we'll talk a little bit about Abimelech, but he's not a judge, but he's like a supervillain. So we'll talk a little bit about Abimelech. But so you have Deborah, and then Deborah writes this beautiful song that's in chapter 5 that goes on, and it just talks about the wonderful things that happened throughout between Barak and Deborah and saving the Israelites. And so the two of them save Israel, and they move on, and they get another 40 years of peace. So there we go, another 40. So we've got 40 from Othniel, 80 from Ehud. We didn't hear anything from Shamgar because he just killed 600 people, and then Deborah saved 40. We got 40 years out of Deborah. So these are pretty interesting things. So, and it's interesting to note that Barak does all of the execution of Deborah's plans, but Deborah does all the planning and delegates to Barak throughout the book. And then we get one of the famous ones, number 5. We get one of the famous ones that everybody knows is Gideon. And Gideon is one of my favorites, but Gideon's a little famous judge. A lot of us remember stories of Gideon's from like Bible school and things like that. But what we didn't hear in Bible school that Gideon has is Gideon's got a pretty awesome nickname. So he is called Jerub-Baal. And Jerub-Baal means let Baal contend. So his nickname literally means I'm going to fight the devil, which that's pretty awesome. That's a pretty cool nickname. I just think that's kind of neat. He's like got a BA nickname. Anyway, so Gideon's story kind of begins where the Israelites have been in persecution for 7 years after the 40 years of peace from Deborah. So, but it was a rough 7 years. So we didn't hear how bad the 7 years was before Ehud, or the 18 years before Ehud, but we just know that the king like basically took all their food and they were starving. But during Gideon's time, it was so bad that Gideon was threshing wheat when the angel of the Lord appeared to him, and he was threshing wheat in the wine press so he could hide, because if the Philistines saw, and I'm going to make sure I'm right there on the Philistines, right? Midianites, I'm sorry. When the Midianites would see people threshing wheat, they would see the wheat shaft that would fly up in the air. They had spotters on the hills that would look, and when they would see the threshing of wheat, they would run out there and steal their wheat. So people had to hide threshing wheat. They They couldn't even get the grain that they needed to make the bread, let alone make the bread. So it was really bad. These were some horrible, horrible years. And so the angel, and because it was only 7 years, then we know that Gideon at some point must have been born during the 40 years of peace. So he saw when he was a little kid, like, hey, this is awesome. And then it got really bad really fast. So he may be a little bit sour, you know? Yeah, maybe. So we have an angel that appears to Gideon while he's threshing wheat. And let's go to chapter 6, verse 11 real quick. Because it's kind of a funny story. And I'm going to read it and then I'll recap. So the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abizarite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "But sir," Gideon replied, "if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told about us when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and put into the hand of Midian." So Gideon's response, to kind of like wrap that up in an Old Testament nutshell into modern day terminology, is like, where have you been? You know, like, this is bad. And your excuse for showing up now while I'm sitting here in a wine press hiding is what? Like, not timely, you know? So he's a little bit salty. Gideon's a little bit salty that this is this bad. So, he and the angel kind of go back and forth, and then there's a burnt offering, and the angel burns it up instantaneously and disappears, and then Gideon is like, oh, all right, maybe I shouldn't have said the things that I said. That wasn't really cool. He's like, but it's still really bad. So we have the story of the fleece that most of you are familiar with from Vacation Bible School or Bible school, where the dew on the fleece and then the dew not on the fleece. And then that's when Gideon goes out and he destroys all the altars of Baal, and that's why he gets the nickname of Jerubbaal. And then Gideon's like, okay, so now I'm supposed to lead Israel we're supposed to lead Israel out of oppression right now? Okay, cool. Let me get my army going. So he goes around and he collects up all of these dudes and to make this fight and to get this army going. And he's got an army of 32,000. And Gideon's like, yes, I've got an army of 32,000 people. And then God's like, no, that's too much. Look at them and see who is afraid. And if they're afraid, send them away. So Gideon's like, all right, but these are warriors. So he goes out and he starts looking. Of his 32,000, 22,000 of them were afraid. So they all left. So now Gideon's like, yes, I have an army of 10,000. And then God's like, no, go make them drink some water or something. So Gideon takes them down to a spring and they drink water. And God says, hey, anybody that puts their face to the water and drinks like a dog, send them away. But anybody who picks up the water and brings it to their mouth, like, they can stay. They're cool. So Gideon does that. And there's a lot of reasons, both tactical and spiritual, for that movement, right? So if you put your face in the water, you're used to bowing down with your face to the ground, which is how at the time you would pray to, like, Dagon or Baal or Asherah. So they would be used to doing that. They would have a little muscle memory with that position, and that would indicate that they weren't necessarily followers of true God, or that they were repentant. So that was one. The other one was the fact that if you put your face in the water and drink, you can't see what's going on around you. So you're not really effective in combat when your face is in the water. So it's, this motion, you're a little bit more aware and alert. So Gideon does that, and a bunch of people drink. 9,700 lap like dogs out of the water. So out of 32,000, we're down to 300. So then Gideon at first, 32,000, God, no. 10,000, no. 300. God's like, yes, make that happen. So they go down to where the enemy is in camp. And the other thing that's interesting here is that they didn't bring swords at all to go fight the enemy. So God's like, no, you need to bring a trumpet or a shofar, which is the ram's horn, and you need to bring a trumpet, you need to bring a torch, and you need to bring a clay pot. And weirdest packing list ever for war, by the way. So all these Israelites, they got this pot and a torch and a trumpet, and they're like, I'm not sure, are we making soup? I don't know what's going on. So they go to, and they surround this encampment, and then God tells Gideon, all right, so when I tell you to, everybody needs to light their torches and hold them up, blow their shofars, and then break their pots. And Gideon's like, all right, cool, weird ritual, but whatever you need. So everybody does that, and they're sitting actually in a basin. So the Israelites are on the rim of the basin, and the enemy encampment is inside of it. And the sound and the light would have echoed and reverberated through that basin, and it would have sounded like the horse hooves and rolling chariots coming down into the basin. So, and then you see all the torches, and you think that it's all like enemy armies are pouring in. So that happened while they were sleeping, while the enemies were sleeping, and the Lord confused them, and they all killed each other. And then, the remnants ran away, and Gideon chased them down, and they killed them then. But it was kind of like, God's like, see, I told you. You don't need weapons, and you don't need 32,000 people. And Gideon was like, yeah, cool, yeah. So then we have Gideon has to continue to chase after two particularly bad individuals, where you have your two kind of, I guess, preliminary supervillains of Zeba and Zalmunna. And Zeba and Zalmunna are pretty bad guys. They're kind of the generals of the Midianite army. And this is kind of where Gideon starts to get into politics. And he ends up there. But when Gideon catches up with Zeba and Zalmunna, he finds out that they killed his brothers. So he's kind of distraught, and he tells his little boy to kill those two guys, but his little boy can't do it. So Gideon has to do it himself. And then after they die, Gideon leads, and he does some kind of messed up things with an idol, which leads to Abimelech. But in the meantime of that happening, we get 40 years of peace. So Gideon, 40 years of peace after that. So Gideon makes this idol during that time period, and then his son, Abimelech, comes along. And Abimelech is a supervillain, for the lack of a better term. He is a terrible, terrible person. He rules Israel, but he's not a judge. He does a lot of horrible, horrible things. Is not a good guy, and he ends up getting killed. He's one of those ones that says, I don't want to die by the hand of a woman. And then when he assaults a tower, what he would do is he would raid a city. He would raid a city, and then he would crowd everybody into the temple of that city, or into the meeting place of that city, and then trap them in it and burn them alive. So he was kind of a bad dude, right? So he's notorious bad dude. So we even use examples of what Abimelech did in movies now to show how bad dudes really are. So he was the trendsetter of bad guy. So there goes Abimelech into his thing, and he's a really bad dude. Burns all these people. And one of the instances when he was burning somebody decided to push a block off the top of the tower and hit him on the head. And that was pretty much the end of Abimelech. So then we get another judge. But before we go to the next judge, we're going to stop, and we're going to talk about lessons from Deborah and Gideon. So what are some leadership lessons that we can glean from Deborah and Gideon? One, from Deborah, sometimes delegation is the key to success. So a leader delegates, and we see that Christ does that. He delegates to Paul. He delegates to his apostles. He delegates to John the Baptist. I mean, he gives people instruction. The army defines leadership as giving purpose, direction, and motivation, and Jesus does that when he delegates every single time. He provides purpose, direction, and motivation to anybody that he sends out to do his will. Another thing we can learn: men and women are equal in God's eyes. It's not this is for men or this is for women as far as prophets. That's a social construct and not necessarily God's construct. So we can see that reflected in the way that Jesus treats men and women both in the New Testament. Another one, to quote Yoda for this, is size matters not. Gideon was a small guy, right? So Gideon was the weakest of his family, and his family was poor. So Gideon was this tiny guy that did these amazing feats and these very fantastic things. So size doesn't matter to God. You know, like I said before, with God on your side, numbers are irrelevant. So faith means more than strength. Again, from Gideon, you know, going in with 32,000 people and then being reduced to 300, faith means more than physical prowess or strength. And the last thing is about Abimelech. So, and that's this one's kind of a tough lesson in leadership, is that sometimes everybody has free will. So sometimes just because you did everything and you taught right, they may not lead, or they may not follow, and they may go a different route. Such was the case with Abimelech. So, yes, I think it does count for age too. So moving on to the next, number 6 is Tola. Tola is one of those ones that gets not much mentioned. I guess he was kind of uneventful. He led Israel for 23 years. He basically was, it's 1 or 2 verses again, and Tola rose up, led Israel, and died. And that's kind of the end of it. That's pretty much all he did, rather uneventful. And then we had Jair. And Jair is when we get a little strange. And we have some numbers. And it's kind of one of those things where, in the context of all this brutality and this violence, we have some very interesting things going on, where we had Jair led Israel for 22 years. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys, and they controlled 30 towns. And that is pretty much all that's said about Jair. So donkeys apparently were really important in his life, because how important does your donkey have to be to get mentioned in the Bible? Like that's one hell of a donkey. And you had 30 of them, your sons. You had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. Now, I don't know if that's each one had 30 donkeys, or if that's each one had a donkey, and because there were 30, there were also 30 donkeys. But nevertheless, there were 30 donkeys somewhere in the mix, and there were 30 sons, and there were 30 towns. So maybe 1 town per donkey per son. And that was pretty much all that's mentioned of him at all. So it's kind of like, well, wow, what do you know, okay. Apparently that's for somebody. I don't know what I'm supposed to get out of that, Lord, but the donkeys maybe, I don't know. But it's interesting because donkeys are used a lot, actually, in symbology, and we'll kind of talk about that towards the end here. But it's important to remember that there were 30 donkeys. It's also interesting that we have 30, 30, 30, right? So we now have 2 numbers that are involved. We have 30 and we have 3, right? So those are both pretty important. Okay, moving on. Then we have Jephthah. And Jephthah pops up after Jair after 18 years of oppression. Wait a minute, 18. Well, that's the second time that 18 is referenced, by the way. So Jephthah, we have, then we have this kind of weird interaction with Jephthah where the people cry out because they're in captivity for 18 years, and the people cry out to God, and God kind of has a bit of an attitude when he comes back to them, and God says, I'm sick, basically in modern text, I'm sick of you. If you like Baal so much, go ask him for help, see if he saves you. Israel repents. God, I really can't stay mad at you. All right, so here comes Jephthah. So Jephthah, again, a guy without an excuse, right? In the book of no excuses. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute, but his father had a wife and had a bunch of sons there. So like his dad had cheated on his wife with a prostitute. The prostitute gave birth to Jephthah, and here he is. So this is like bastard son. But what it says is that about Jephthah, that he was a mighty warrior. So the Bible calls him a mighty warrior. That's a pretty strong endorsement. That's a good recommendation letter, considering that people like David killed 10,000 people and wasn't called, and he was called a mighty warrior. So Jephthah is pretty up there in the ranks. So here's Jephthah, this mighty warrior, but he got there. So yeah, that's pretty much, yeah. So we have Jephthah, he learns from the school of hard knocks, right? So as soon as he gets grown up, his brothers kick him out, and they're like, hey, you're a father's son, but you're not our mother's son. We hate you. Get out of here. Go live in the desert. And basically he becomes the leader of like the 40 thieves. Like he gathers this like band of miscreants and misfits and this like ill repute band as he's just roaming around the desert, but he's not like a bad guy. He's just kind of like a renegade. So Jephthah's out there. He's kind of like, I picture him then when the elders of Israel come to ask him to be their judge, Jephthah's, like sitting in like some dusty biker bar, and like they walk in and there's all these sneers, and Jephthah's sitting there at the table like slamming shots or something. And then they talk to him and he's like, hi, like he's actually a really nice dude. So because he was a good man of God, even though he was on the east side, he was on the on the east bank of the Jordan. So he's out in evil land, but he's like this upstanding guy. So the elders of Israel go to Jephthah and they're like, so seriously, like we need you to come save us because you're a strong warrior and we're all wimps. And Jephthah's like, well, I'm not really cool. I mean, you guys like kicked me out and sent me out in the desert, and I have to live amongst these like weirdos. And the elders are like, well, if you come and lead us, we'll like make you our head. We'll make you the leader of all Israel. And he's like, yeah, like for real? Like I'll be at the top? And they're like, yeah, for real. Come on. So he agrees, and the Spirit of the Lord comes on Jephthah in power, and he makes a vow to God, and this is the part where people mistake Jephthah's intentions a lot. So he makes a vow, and we can kind of go there very well. I'll touch on it because we're running short on time. So Jephthah he makes a vow that he will sacrifice anything when he comes back being victorious from saving Israel. He'll make a vow that he's going to sacrifice anything that comes across his door. That is mistranslated. There's an and that is mistranslated. It should be an or. That he will dedicate or sacrifice, not dedicate and sacrifice anything that comes through his door, because obviously that would create a contradiction. If it was a human being that came through the door, he would be making a human sacrifice to God, which God doesn't recognize, no Levite would do, and he would basically be a massive sinner. So he does do that. He does come through, and it is a person that comes and greets him at the door. It's his daughter, his only daughter, who is too young. So it does, many scholars would tell you that he does sacrifice his child, but that can't be true because it would create a myriad of other problems. It is evident that he dedicates her to God. So then Jephthah continues, and Jephthah meets the men of Ephraim, and the men of Ephraim, it's like the collective, and they kind of meet him at the river, and they're like, what happened, bro? We were supposed to fight the Amorites together, but instead you just went off and did that all on your own. And Jephthah was kind of like, dude, I called you, but you didn't answer me, and so I had to do me. And the men of Ephraim were kind of like, okay, you're crazy, and we're going to kill you now, which that's kind of an escalation that doesn't really need to happen. So Jephthah's like, all right, say Sibboleth. Or say Shibboleth, and they're like, what? Okay, Sibboleth. And he's like, yeah, that's what I thought, and kills 42,000 people. So it's this really weird transaction that if you read it, it's kind of strange. But what it comes from is the fact that their language, if the Ephraimites, the correspondence that was going on before was via messenger, and the Ephraimites had a different way of pronouncing, or a different accent. So when they tried to cross the Jordan at the time to assault, they were trying to do it all sneaky-like, and Jephthah put people at the crossings and used it as like a challenge and password. So he would say, as people crossed the river, he would say, okay, say Shibboleth, and when they would say Sibboleth, he was like, yeah, that's what I thought, you're an Ephraimite, and he killed them all. So in total, he killed 42,000 people. That's a lot of people. but he saved Israel. So some leadership lessons that we can learn from Tola, Jair, and Jephthah. One is to fulfill your commitments. Jephthah didn't want to necessarily have to dedicate his only child to God initially, because it means he has no grandchildren. She has to be a virgin for her entire life. So he wouldn't have any. She was his only child, and he wouldn't have any grandchildren. But he fulfilled his commitments. He made a promise to God, and he did that. He fulfilled it. Another one is, if you lead, people will follow you. If you take charge, people will follow you. When Jephthah took over, it was, all right, let's go, and people followed him. He was just this miscreant from nowhere, comes out, he's a mighty warrior, and leads the people. You're going to get, another one is, hey, this is just a tip of the hat kind of thing, but you're going to get made fun of because you have an unusual birth. So, Jephthah's mother was a prostitute. I can't imagine what was said to Jesus about his mother, being born of an immaculate conception. I'm sure nobody believed that, and people made fun of him and called his mother all kinds of horrible names. So, kind of like a kindred spirit in that regard between Jephthah. Another one, families are messy. Jephthah's brothers didn't really care for him very much. Families can get messy. And sometimes our lives are tough, rough, and painful. Jephthah wasn't always treated so nicely, even though he was a judge. Okay, we're almost done. Number 9, Ibzan. Ibzan is another one we're in chapter 12 at this point. Ibzan is another one that gets the weird 30. So Ibzan had 30 sons, 30 daughters, and then he traded his 30 daughters for 30. That's right, exactly. Christ's family wasn't always with him. Ibzan had 30 sons, 30 daughters, and he traded his 30 daughters for 30 daughters-in-law. So here's another 3 sets of 30. And that's pretty much all that's said of him. And then we have Elon, who was probably the most uneventful of all of them. So in chapter 12, verse 11, after him, Elon, the Zebulunite, led Israel for 10 years, and then he died, and he was buried. And that's it. So he literally took charge and died. And he was very uneventful. Like Taft, as our President Taft. He just kind of, I'm just kidding, but you get my point. And then we had Abdon. And Abdon, we get another numerology kind of a thing. And then we also get the donkeys come back out. So Abdon had 40 sons, 30 grandsons. And then who rode 70 donkeys? So again, we're not sure, did the 30 grandsons ride 70 donkeys? Was that 70 donkeys because there was 40 for the sons and 30 for the grandsons, making 70? But nonetheless, there was a whole bunch of donkeys, a lot more than before. And that's kind of big. So then we go to number 12. And number 12 is probably the most famous judge that's there, and that's Samson. Samson being the most famous judge that out of the book. Everybody knows the stories of Samson. We have a very weird angelic visit. The whole time that the angel visits with Samson's parents, it's very, very awkward. So if you read the block, they ask the angel weird things. The angel responds weirdly, and then kind of like just disappears in a column of fire, and then and then they freak out. So it's just a very kind of awkward transaction between the two. So it just kind of goes to show that not everything is swimmingly, and people have weird ideas. And then Samson is a Nazirite, and the Nazirites couldn't touch alcohol, they couldn't sin, and they couldn't cut their hair, as I'm sure you're aware of the story of Samson. And I don't want to necessarily get real deep into it, but he does a lot of Samson kills a lot of people, and Samson led Israel for 20 years, and then he gets kind of the chink in his armor is Delilah, who takes him down. And but one of the things that's important to understand is, though Samson does all of these things and saves Israel, in the end Samson lost his strength, right? So Delilah cut his hair, and he lost the spirit of the Lord had left him, and he lost all of his strength. And then the Philistines did absolutely abject things to him publicly, and then put him up in a palace to do more. And he prayed for forgiveness, received forgiveness, got his strength back, and took down the entire palace and killed a whole bunch. So, some of the things that we can learn here. One thing, and a lot of these are from Samson, because it's what the majority of the text is about, is that Jesus' lessons from Samson is turning the other cheek, is almost coming out of Samson, that the idea of not reacting with violence, because Samson, every time Samson reacted in violence, personally, something else was worse happened to him. People pursued him. It just got worse for him. He saved Israel, but then he did things with like malice. God works with what he has. Samson apparently had a little bit of an anger problem, but God works with them. He was a human being, so God works with what he has. The other one is that God's forgiveness is immeasurable, right? So Samson had this dedication from birth that he was supposed to live this very pristine life, and he betrayed that. But when he asked for forgiveness, when he begged for forgiveness from God, he got it. He didn't have to. The law of Moses was in effect at this time, but Samson couldn't go sacrifice a sheep for his sins. He just asked for it and he received it. So God's forgiveness is immeasurable. It doesn't, it's very up to him. The covenants, any covenant, in this case it was a Nazirite covenant. Covenants are a big deal, and Jesus needed to know that. So when Jesus was reading this and going, wait a minute, I'm set apart from birth. I have a covenant. I have a major obligation. This is a big deal. When Samson violated his covenant, it was a big deal. The people were oppressed, in no small way. If Jesus had violated his covenant, we would be oppressed, and then sinning has consequences. So there's, these are some things that he would have noticed. So I'm running long, so I'm trying to hurry up. So numbers, let's go back and talk about some numbers that we saw. We saw 3. 3 is usually the number of completion, or a number of it's together, right? 30. 30 has a timely association to it, so that the symptom or the effect of 30 is that this is the right moment or the right time, or this was the right amount of things. This is something about this is timely, is exact. So this is where that 3 out of 30 comes out of, is that you have these 3 sets of 30. This was the complete right amount. This was exactly the way that it was supposed to be. It was the right moment. After that, everything was okay during this time. It gives you just an overall sense that it was perfect, that it was prosperity. It was correct. It was the way it should have been, which is important because when you get into the trial periods, now you have 40. And 40 is used a lot, right? So Jesus was walking around in the desert for 40 days. The Israelites were wandering in the desert for 40 years. And you have 40 years of peace. That's right. These numbers information I've taken from Bollinger. This 40 you have, this is like used like a parole time or a trial period. This kind of period of trial or period of testing or period of parole that God uses, and it's unique because also it's approximately 40 years is about 1 generation. So this time period that's used is 1 generation's worth to try to test these people. So some other symbol. Oh, and the other one was 12. There were 12 judges, right? We know that 12 is connected with faith and representative of complete faith. So we have 12 judges. We also had 12 apostles. There's a lot of number nods throughout. So 2 other symbols that we see in Judges that comes up a lot. One is unconventional weaponry. We saw the ox goad. We saw Samson kill 1,000 people with the fresh jawbone of a donkey. fresh, meaning like he pulled it off of a donkey. So yeah, again, I went over that, but it does say a fresh donkey's jawbone. So and then starts killing me. Talking about an unconventional weapon? It's a jawbone. Anyway, so unconventional weaponry. Why do you think there was unconventional weaponry used? One, because we want, it makes it more important to show that God was involved. Two, it is very likely that the Israelites were disarmed by whoever was their captors. Another one is donkeys. The weird donkey references that just popped up. 30 donkeys, 70 donkeys. Well, donkeys are used as a symbol of prosperity and peace and farming throughout the Old Testament. So if it were horses, which horses are used too, but horses are usually associated with war or times of strife, because to see donkeys in front of chariots would have been a rather strange sight. You would have had these very long-eared, floppy, very obstinate donkeys. You're sitting there whipping them on the chariot, and they're not doing anything. And this guy is just going to town, whipping the donkey, and the donkey's doing nothing. So it would have been very weird to have chariots run by donkeys. So donkeys were typically used for peace and prosperity, and horses were used for war. So to say that we had 30 donkeys, we had 70 donkeys, it usually connotates that there was a whole lot of peace, that there was a lot of prosperity, that there was food abundance, that we had a lot of things going on there. So we continue on there. There's a running theme throughout all of these stories. We have another running theme, that a leader, we have a lot of violence throughout this, right? We have a lot of violence, and violence in these books are not necessarily that they are committing the acts of violence, but they are exposed to the violence in some way, shape, form, or fashion. Deborah didn't commit any acts of violence, but she was exposed. Samson, he was both exposed and committed acts of violence. But what you have is that a leader must be willing to act. He must be willing to be in the thick of it. And sometimes, more times often than not, that's going to result in conflict. There's going to be some kind of violence. There's going to be some kind of disagreement and discord, because when you're leading a group, you're meeting the adversary head on. So a running theme throughout Judges for Christ to learn is that you are going to face the devil, and you are going to have to fight him. And you will be victorious, because I am with you. The Lord, is with you. But in order to do that, in order to free the Lord's people, you must confront the enemy. It has to be done. He will not back down. He will continue to assault my people, as he had over and over and over and over and over again. And my people are kind of dumb, and they follow him for some unknown reason. So you're going to have to face this rejection. You're going to have to face this disappointment, but they come back, and you have to continue to drive and fight the enemy. That is a running theme throughout all of Judges. And that is a lesson that Christ would have picked up from reading the entire book, is that there is a leadership aspect here, and that Christ must face the enemy. And sometimes that will result in some strife. Sometimes you're going to go through some horrible things. Sometimes it's going to be violent. But if you lead them, they will follow you. If you teach people and you follow the covenants, they will follow. If you go through and lead from the front and get your hands dirty, they will follow you. So those are the messages and the lessons of leadership that Christ would have learned from Judges, in my opinion. So I hope that some of you laughed and some of you enjoyed it, and complete.